I found my 91-year-old grandmother sitting in her wheelchair at the bottom of her own front steps, unable to get into her house, because the portable threshold lift that had let her come and go independently for the past 2 years had been removed sometime that morning by a crew hired by our HOA, hauled away in a truck while she'd been at a doctor's appointment, and replaced with nothing but a hand-lettered sign staked into the grass reading, "Unauthorized sidewalk obstruction removed per community standards." My name is Desmond Achterberg Grays. My grandmother, Coretta, has lived in her small single-story home in Willowmere Estates for over 30 years, longer than almost anyone else in the community. And about 2 years before this story starts, after a hip replacement left her permanently reliant on a wheelchair for mobility outside the house, my family installed a portable threshold lift at her front entrance, a modest, code-compliant device that raised her wheelchair the 11 inches from the front walkway up to her door level, allowing her to enter and exit her own home independently rather than needing someone to physically lift her wheelchair every single time. I want to establish clearly, because it matters enormously for everything that follows, that this installation had gone through every proper channel imaginable. We had submitted a formal accommodation request to the HOA under the Fair Housing Act, including documentation from Coretta's physician establishing medical necessity, and had received written approval from the board within 2 weeks, a board led at the time by a genuinely reasonable man named Bartholomew Ferreira, who told my mother, when the approval was granted, that he was glad the community could support exactly this kind of need. Bartholomew retired from the board about 14 months later, replaced through an uncontested election by a woman named Priscilla Wentworth Ashby, and I want to walk you through how her tenure unfolded, because the pattern matters for understanding how something as extreme as repossessing a disabled elderly woman's mobility device while she was out of the house ever came to happen. Priscilla's presidency, from nearly its outset, focused heavily on what she described in her first newsletter as restoring uniform streetscape presentation across the community, language that, within her first several months, translated into an aggressive campaign of citations targeting anything visible from the public sidewalk that she considered inconsistent with what she called the community's clean line aesthetic, disputes over garden gnomes, decorative mailbox posts, and eventually, my grandmother's lift, despite the fact that it had been formally approved under the previous board nearly a year before Priscilla ever took office. I received a letter on my grandmother's behalf, since I handle most of her HOA correspondence given her age and the physical difficulty she has with paperwork, informing us that the lift would need to undergo a supplemental review due to concerns that it extended into the community sidewalk right-of-way in a manner inconsistent with streetscape guidelines, and requesting that we either remove it voluntarily within 30 days or face the board's own removal action, along with associated fees. I want to tell you about the phone call I had with Priscilla directly after receiving that letter, because I think it reveals something important about the confidence with which she made claims that, as I would soon discover, had no actual legal basis at all. I explained that the lift had received prior formal approval as a documented disability accommodation, and asked specifically what had changed to prompt this new review. Her answer was that the board had determined the lift's footprint extended slightly onto the sidewalk itself, which she characterized as HOA-controlled common area subject to the same aesthetic guidelines as any other community common space, and that this technical detail, regardless of the accommodation's underlying medical necessity, brought it under the board's separate authority over shared right-of-way areas. I want to walk you through the research I did over the following week, because it turned out to be the single most important thing I did in this entire situation. I want to explain something that I did not fully understand before this dispute began, and that I suspect many homeowners across the country don't fully understand either, which is that the sidewalk running in front of a private residential lot is not automatically HOA property just because it happens to sit within a community's boundaries. In many jurisdictions, including ours, residential sidewalks are dedicated to and maintained by the municipality itself, part of the public right-of-way, even when they run through a privately governed HOA community, a distinction that matters enormously for determining who actually has legal authority over what happens on them. I called our city's Public Works Department directly, explained the situation, and asked a simple, direct question: whether the sidewalk in front of my grandmother's home was HOA-owned common area or municipal public right-of-way. The woman I spoke with pulled up our specific address and confirmed, within minutes, that the sidewalk had been dedicated to the city as part of the original subdivision plat filed when Willowmere Estates was developed decades earlier, meaning it was, and had always been, public property maintained by the municipality, not HOA common area subject to the board's separate aesthetic or use authority at all. I want to sit with what this actually meant, because it took me a moment to fully process it myself. Priscilla Wentworth Ashby had claimed authority over a piece of public municipal infrastructure that her board had never had any jurisdiction over whatsoever, using that fabricated authority to override a properly approved federal disability accommodation, and had gone so far as to physically remove a 91-year-old woman's mobility device from her own property, based entirely on this non-existent jurisdiction. I called the City Public Works office back and requested written confirmation of the sidewalk's public right-of-way status, which they provided within a few days. A simple one-page letter on official letterhead confirming the exact parcel boundaries, and stating clearly that the sidewalk fell under the city's maintenance and regulatory authority, not any private homeowners association. I want to introduce you to my aunt, Farah Echterbergen-Wasu, Coretta's daughter and my mother's older sister, who happens to work as a paralegal specializing in disability rights and fair housing cases, a professional background that turned out to be extraordinarily useful given exactly the situation our family now found itself in. Farah reviewed the original accommodation approval, the city's public right-of-way confirmation, and Priscilla's letter demanding removal, and told me something that reframed the entire situation. "Desmond," she said, "this isn't just an HOA overreach anymore. This is a board asserting authority it never had over public municipal property, specifically to override a federally protected disability accommodation that had already been formally approved. And the fact that they didn't just deny a request, they physically repossessed an elderly disabled woman's mobility device while she was out of the house, without any notice given directly to her, is going to make this an unusually serious case once the right people see the full timeline. I want to tell you about the moment I realized just how deliberately this had been timed, because it mattered enormously for what happened next. Coretta's doctor's appointment that morning had been scheduled for months, a routine checkup that my mother had mentioned, in passing, to a neighbor a few weeks earlier. A neighbor who, we would later confirm through a records request Farah helped us file, happened to be someone who regularly corresponded with Priscilla about community matters. Whether that information had been passed along intentionally or simply mentioned in casual conversation that reached Priscilla by coincidence, the removal crew had undeniably been scheduled for the exact 3-hour window my grandmother was known to be away from her home, at an appointment she could not have rescheduled, leaving her with no opportunity to object, explain, or even witness what was happening to her own property before it was already gone. That timing and the question of exactly how Priscilla had known to schedule it is where Part 2 picks up, along with what Farah discovered once she began digging into whether this was the very first time Priscilla had asserted authority over land that, as it would turn out, had never belonged to the HOA at all. Farah's investigation into whether this was an isolated incident took about 2 weeks, and what she found, cross-referencing HOA meeting minutes going back over Priscilla's entire tenure against the city's public right-of-way records, revealed a pattern considerably broader than either of us had expected. Twice before, Priscilla's board had cited homeowners for violations involving items placed near the public sidewalk. In one case, a small decorative planter. In another, a temporary basketball hoop, both times asserting the same claimed authority over community right-of-way aesthetics that had no basis whatsoever in the actual jurisdictional boundaries the city itself maintained. Both prior homeowners, once Farah reached out to them directly, had simply complied with the citations rather than fight them, one removing the planter entirely, the other relocating the basketball hoop at some inconvenience, both under the impression, as they explained to Farah, that the board's assertion of authority must have some legitimate basis they didn't personally understand. Exactly the same assumption I might have made myself had I not happened to make that first phone call to Public Works. "This is the detail that matters most for how we handle your grandmother's case," Farah told me, laying out the pattern across my kitchen table. "This isn't a one-time misunderstanding about a boundary. This is a repeated practice of asserting jurisdiction over public property that the board has never had any legal claim to, and using that fabricated authority to force compliance from residents who reasonably assumed the board wouldn't simply invent authority it didn't have. Combined with the disability accommodation angle in your grandmother's specific case, and the deliberate timing around her medical appointment, I think this is a strong candidate for both a civil claim and a formal complaint to the state's Fair Housing Enforcement Office." Farah helped me file a formal fair housing complaint within the week, laying out the original accommodation approval, the board's baseless assertion of authority over city-owned right-of-way, and the specific circumstances of the lift's removal during Coretta's medical appointment, an act that Farah's complaint characterized as a particularly egregious violation, given both the deliberate timing and the complete disregard for a properly documented federal accommodation. I want to walk you through what happened once the state's Fair Housing Office began its own review, because it moved considerably faster than either of us expected. Largely, the investigator later told us, because cases involving elderly and disabled residents tend to receive expedited attention given the heightened vulnerability involved. The investigator assigned to our case, a methodical woman named Odalise Kowalska-Ferreira, requested the HOA's complete records related to the lift's approval and subsequent removal, along with Priscilla's own internal communications regarding the removal's scheduling. What that request surfaced, much like in the two prior citation incidents Farah had already uncovered, was an email from Priscilla to the removal contractor, sent about a week before the incident, specifically referencing a window when the resident will be away, and instructing the crew to complete the removal during that specific time frame. Language that, once combined with a separate message thread showing Priscilla had, in fact, learned about Coretta's appointment schedule through the neighbor Farah had already identified, established beyond any real dispute that this had been deliberately timed to avoid any possibility of Coretta objecting or documenting the situation before her property was already removed. I want to tell you about the moment Odalise called to walk us through her preliminary findings, because it was the first time since finding my grandmother stranded at the bottom of her own steps that I felt something shift from raw anger into focused resolve. "This is one of the clearer cases I've handled," she told us. "You have a properly documented federal accommodation, willfully overridden based on an authority claim that has no legal basis whatsoever given the sidewalk's actual public right-of-way status, executed with deliberate timing specifically to prevent the resident from being present to object. I'm recommending this proceed to a formal finding against the association, and I want to be direct with you. Given the pattern of similarly baseless citations you've already identified independently, I think this case is going to matter for more households in that community than just your grandmother's." The formal finding, issued about 3 months later, concluded that Willowmere Estates Board had violated the Fair Housing Act's reasonable accommodation provisions, and separately, had exceeded its lawful authority by asserting jurisdiction over municipal public right-of-way property it had no legal claim to regulate. The finding required the immediate restoration of Coretta's threshold lift at the HOA's expense, formal compensation for the period she had been unable to safely access her own home, and a mandatory training requirement for the entire board regarding both fair housing accommodation obligations and the actual jurisdictional boundaries of HOA authority relative to public infrastructure. I want to walk you through what happened at the community level, because the fair housing finding, once it became part of the public record, triggered exactly the kind of internal reckoning that similar situations I've heard about from friends dealing with their own overreaching HOA boards eventually produce. A special membership meeting was called, and this time, unlike the informal, poorly attended session that had originally established Priscilla's aesthetic citation practices in the first place, the room was full, packed with residents who had, once word of the fair housing finding spread, started asking uncomfortable questions about their own prior citations involving items near the sidewalk. The two homeowners who had previously complied with Priscilla's baseless sidewalk citations, the one with the planter and the one with the basketball hoop, both attended that meeting and spoke publicly for the first time about what had happened to them, adding their own experiences to the growing picture of a board president who had, for well over a year, been asserting authority over property she never had any legal claim to regulate. The vote to remove Priscilla from the board was overwhelming, and the community additionally passed a formal resolution requiring any future board action citing common area or right-of-way authority to be verified against actual municipal property records before any enforcement action could proceed. A policy several longtime residents told me afterward felt embarrassingly obvious in hindsight, but that, much like so many of these situations, had never been written down as an explicit requirement until a genuinely serious violation forced the community to confront how easily that kind of unchecked, invented authority could be wielded against exactly the residents least able to fight back against it. I want to tell you about the day the lift was reinstalled, because I remember standing with my mother and Farah on Coretta's front walkway, watching the same crew that had removed it months earlier now reinstalling it, this time at the HOA's own expense, and watching my grandmother, once it was fully operational again, wheel herself up to her own front door independently for the first time in nearly 4 months. A small, quiet moment that meant considerably more to our family than any settlement check or formal finding ever could. Coretta, for her part, when we explained the full resolution to her, mostly wanted to know whether Priscilla had ever apologized directly, a question that, I'll admit, none of us had a particularly satisfying answer to, since Priscilla's involvement in the entire process, once her attorney became engaged, remained purely procedural, no direct communication, no acknowledgement beyond what the formal settlement required. Coretta, hearing this, simply shrugged in the particular way she has and said that she'd gotten her lift back, and that was really all she needed, a perspective that I think, honestly, reflects a kind of grace neither Farah nor I quite managed to hold onto ourselves throughout the entire ordeal. If there's a lesson in this story, I think it's something Farah said to me during one of our early meetings, reviewing the city's public right-of-way confirmation letter for what felt like the 5th time. She said that people who abuse small positions of local authority often rely on the fact that most residents simply assume institutional confidence reflects institutional legitimacy, that if someone asserts authority firmly and repeatedly enough, using official-sounding language about community standards and streetscape guidelines, most people won't think to actually verify whether that authority exists at all. The moment you make one simple phone call to the actual governing body, in this case, Nothing more complicated than calling Public Works and asking a direct question. That entire assumed authority can evaporate completely, revealed as having never existed in the first place. We made that phone call, and it turns out that one Public Works employee willing to check a property record, one aunt with exactly the right professional background to recognize a fair housing violation when she saw one, and one 91-year-old woman's quiet insistence that all she really wanted was her lift back, were more than enough to make sure Priscilla Wentworth Ashby never got to invent authority over a single inch of public sidewalk again. Thumbnail text. She took my grandmother's lift away.